Hello and welcome at the press presentation of the Aging Readiness and Competitiveness report here at the Sustainable Development Impact Summit in New York. This is a presentation of a report made by AARP, of which we have a representative here today, and FP Analytics, of whom we also have a representative. My name is Peter Vanham. I'm the US Media Lead for the World Economic Forum. And I'm very happy to be talking with all of you about the report today. We'll be talking about this report for about half an hour, but if you want to either download the executive summary or the full report, you can go to arc2018.aarpinternational.org, where you can find, as of now, I believe, the full report. Here to talk about this report, we have three guests. I'm very happy to be joined by three women at this press conference. The first one sits right next to me, Regine Aalders, who comes from a country dear to my heart, from the Netherlands. She's the Counselor Health, Welfare and Sport currently at the Royal Netherlands Embassy in Washington, D.C. Our second speaker, welcome, by the way, our second speaker is Claire Casey. Claire is the Managing Director for FP Analytics. I believe that must be here in New York.
Washington, D.C.
Also in Washington. Well, thanks for coming over. And our third guest and speaker today is Debra Whitman, who is the Chief Public Policy Officer for AARP. And perhaps I want to start with you, Debra, to ask you a few questions about this report. But before I do, why don't you tell us a little bit about what is really AARP and why do you write a report about aging in the first place?
So thank you, Peter, and thank you to the World Economic Forum for hosting this event to release this really important report. AARP is 37 million members over age 50 in the United States. And to put that into perspective, we are slightly larger than the country of Canada. And our goal is to help people have choices about the way that they age in life, to help to advocate on their behalf at the state, local, and federal level, and also meet their needs informationally to provide products and services. We are a force here in the United States, but also globally. We work at the UN to think about things like the Sustainable Development Goals and how we can help people across the world who are aging and across their life course. So why did we do this report and work with our friends at Foreign Policy Analytics? We know that aging doesn't just happen in the United States. Birthdays happen everywhere. And importantly, we are transforming as a world from today, where we have 1 in 10 person worldwide over the age of 60, and by 2050, it will be 1 in 4. Now, this is a massive shift that we as a species have never seen. And we are finding that so little of the conversation around the economics or the social development are addressing the needs of an aging population. So we commissioned this report with Foreign Policy Analytics to take good ideas from across the globe, to study places both large in our first series and smaller in this series, and learn from each other so that we can share those ideas across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've already said it in your introduction, but indeed you've looked last year at 10 larger economies, including the US and then some other countries that we think of when it comes to aging, like Japan, for example. And now you're looking in this new report to smaller countries, 10 countries that have each under 25 million people in their country. And the countries are Australia, Chile, Costa Rica, Lebanon, Mauritius, the Netherlands, of course, New Zealand, Norway, Singapore, and Taiwan. So really from all over the world and from all continents. And the reason you've done so is you say, or you found, that sometimes they're perhaps more nimble or they're more willing to innovate, to adjust their economies to find the solutions for these aging populations. Could you tell us a little bit more about that general finding?
Sure. So the first series of reports were the bigger countries, representing 60% of the population around the globe over age 60. And we found while there were innovations in these countries, there were huge gaps. So this series, we wanted to look at really the movers and shakers around the world. Can we see where countries are taking the needs of their older population around productive opportunity, around technology, around the key areas that we've done for these reports, and really boomeranging themselves? We think that embracing what will be 1/4 of your population is going to be the key competitiveness issue of our time.
Yeah, and you know, of course, you talk about 1/4 of the population, which, as you say, is huge, especially because we're at 10% right now. But I believe that some of these countries that you studied, the share is even higher. I saw numbers up to 35%, so more than 1 in 3 of all people aging. So what are these countries doing? And one of the things, of course, that people think about immediately is, well, if you have so many people that are right now over the retirement age, so to speak, you know, what are they doing in order to make sure that there's still a functioning labor market on the one hand, but on the other hand also to make sure that people who are getting perhaps older but are still very active can also continue to be productive?
And I think that's a great way to think about it. We can't throw away 1/4 of our population. We need to make sure that their strengths and talents are being used, whether it's in the labor force or for volunteerism. There are still a lot that people can give and do. And I think traditionally the conversation about aging populations has only looked at aging as a burden. That's the sort of shift with this report. We look about the technology, the savviness of use of technology in different countries and how they're using technology for somebody who may be unable physically to do things, can use technology to help support them to being more productive longer.
Yeah, and when you talk about that being more productive, you know, it's something that I perhaps should ask Claire also about. You know, it seems to be a finding that you see basically anywhere in whichever country that you've studied. You seem to be finding these kinds of solutions to keep people more productive or to work on productivity. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. One of the things that was consistent across both studies, so we're talking about 22 countries now, is that the desire to be active, the desire to remain productively engaged, is far greater than the ability of our current economies to enable that because of inflexible approaches to retirement, ageism, a range of issues. But we did find some really exciting projects and programs that we could potentially all learn from around the world. One in Singapore, a project called WorkPro, where they're providing grants to companies to actually adjust and adapt their job descriptions and how they approach work to accommodate older workers. So really going to what's going on within the workplace and make it more viable for an older worker to be involved. There are anti-ageism campaigns, education campaigns happening around the world to address this issue. But our experts that we pulled, and we pulled over 125 experts in the 10 countries on aging, they cited productive opportunity as the area that they was least strong of all the 4, and the one that needed the most attention from governments. So that it really is one where there's a lot of room for growth and a lot of room for improvement. The flip side of that is we in the U.S. talk about healthcare as being a sort of intractable problem that we can't get our hands around. That was cited by experts, again, consistently around the world in these 10 countries as an area that they thought was the strongest and where they'd seen the most improvement over the last 3 to 5 years. So there are solutions. We can meet these challenges.
So let's talk a little bit about these solutions, because you know, in some countries, including the ones that I come from, in Belgium, in Western Europe, it seems to be a problem still in terms of regulation for people even to be allowed to work after the age of, say, 65. what are some of the best practices of countries that you've seen that have done particularly something on that aspect of regulation?
So one of the things that I think is again consistent between the 2 years is this idea that we need countries. The current conversation is all about burden. It's also tends to be about extending working lives in a very narrow way. So we talk about making the pension age older. And making people have to work longer, rather than talking about flexibility. How do you accommodate? Why do we one day retire? We go from working a 40-hour week to not at all. That doesn't make a lot of sense given how we age. And so where you're seeing successes, Norway, for example, they coupled pension sector reform with work to create greater flexibility for phased retirement, with anti-ageism campaigns. So they're not just changing the benefit structure, but you're also creating a more holistic solution. And that enables work rather than forcing work.
Yeah.
I want to play off that, because I think one of the studies in Australia, and the point of this is to show that the countries that embrace their aging population are going to be the most successful. Australia looked at the cost to their economy of people not being able to find jobs due to age discrimination. And they found that it was $7.2 billion every year lost because people were out of work, willing to have a job, but couldn't find one because of age discrimination. So this is the point of Claire. You can't just say people have to work longer without having policies that promote lifelong learning, job retraining across the life course, that end age discrimination, that allow flexibility. All of those pieces really need to come together. And in some places, they're starting to do that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And of course, one big aspect that we've just talked about is the aspect of work and being productive, as you call it. Another very big one I understand has to do with infrastructure.
Right.
And again, there you see a number of countries who basically sort of leap ahead or give it at least some solutions, some best practices. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So we talk about community social infrastructure, so sort of the ecosystem that enables aging in place and for people to remain in their communities and homes over time and engage with their communities and access their health care, access productive opportunity. And you do see tremendous examples there of what's working. But before getting into that, I'd like to sort of talk broadly about what we found across all this varied group of countries, very different socioeconomic contexts, very different cultural contexts, programs that were working, things that were really useful solutions that could be replicated, had a few qualities in common. They tended to be very person-oriented, so actually engaging with the older person, their family, other stakeholders. They tended to be holistic in their solution, integrating into the broader society. They tended to be evidence-based and collect data and show metrics for success. They tended to be interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral, cross-specialization. And one example which I'd like to focus on is, and they tend to be bottom up, so coming out of municipalities, people who are on the front lines of dealing with these issues. A municipality called Aalders in Norway has something called the Interdepartmental Housing Team. And this is an economist, a physiotherapist, and a construction expert that goes into the home of an older person, works with them to create a plan to adapt that home so that they can remain in it for years to come, and then helps them access the financing to put that plan into place. So the adapting that home. The U.S. going into a residential care facility costs about $90,000 a year.
A year.
So if you can keep people in their homes for 2 to 3 years, you're saving hundreds of thousands of dollars by making small-scale investments. So it's a municipal-driven, interdisciplinary, person-oriented approach that is yielding huge cost savings. And that's the kind of creativity and innovation that we need to be looking to in scaling, because scale is really the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned it very briefly now is a third element that's probably very important is healthcare. And I want to turn now to our last panelist, Regine, who's actually a specialist, among others, on this topic of health. You come from the Netherlands. There, one of one of the major reforms that has happened, I believe, and it's also highlighted in the report, is the move you've made from a curative system to or from investments in curative care to investments in elderly. Could you tell us a little bit more about that move that's been made and what the results of that are?
Well, we started that path with the start of the present government in October 2017. In the Netherlands, you always have different parties that have to come together. It took them half a year to come together. And they shifted to over $2 billion from curative care to elderly care. Because, you know, in the early days, elderly people were very much in residential care in the Netherlands, even if they were healthy. Now we're trying to really shift to the opposite side and have a participatory society for everybody, leaving no one behind. That requires aging in place, that requires integrated care, which is still an enormous challenge, even in our country, because we have different legislation. Speaking of social support in the community, speaking of a long-term care act, which is great, but sometimes not aligned with the social support. And then we have still the more curative care through our insurance. 3 legislations focusing on elderly people. How do you set up an integrated care? Because the present government has decided not to change any laws, but you don't know for the future if we can keep on holding that. That has to be discussed.
To the existing framework, but so to be clear, then it sort of is the same thing that Claire was talking about, is that you go from basically moving, so to speak, people when they get older into a home to keeping them in the society or the community that they're part of and in their home where they already live. Is that indeed the shift that you've been made?
Yeah, you have 3 challenges there. One is the housing issue, as already Claire told. Also in the Netherlands, there's a lack of efficient, effective housing for the elderly, so we need to do a lot of work there. The second part is the integrated support and care, and the third part is focusing more on the informal caregivers and caretakers. We do have a lot of volunteers, they do a lot of work for family related, but still there's new tasks required and demanded. So we have separate programs of each of these, and on top of that, we also have programs on loneliness now, because many people over 75 feel very lonely. And if you look at the statistics, it's almost half of the people over 75 feel lonely, even in a densely populated country like the Netherlands, where everything is very, very close by. Nevertheless, you don't want them to feel isolated. So you have to find new innovative ways. And these ways and these activities really come from bottom up. But we do have very supportive systems to create innovative e-health, modernized technological solutions. And that's what works in Holland. But also an example of a supermarket where a person who was demented came and forgot to pin. The code of his PIN forgot. So he was sent home without his groceries. Then the supermarket leader discovered this and said, "Oh, I know this lady. We could have helped her." On the basis of this incident, a whole program started now for people in grocery store, supported by the government as a kind of program, but set up through a supermarket called The Giant here, because it's the sister of The Giant in the Netherlands. It's owned by Giant is part of that company. So they now spread it out through the country, which is a simple thing to do, however, important for people that start to be demented to feel at ease, make them at ease so that they still can participate in society, like you have the dementia cafes, like you have the dementia farms we have. So it comes back to really very concrete, specific initiatives supported through the community. And then we have to scale it.
Now, what strikes me about that, and I want to ask the other panelists also their input about this, is that actually, we live in an age, and we always talk at the World Economic Forum about the 4th Industrial Revolution, about technology as a solution for many things. But some of the things that you've mentioned and the other panelists too seem to be sometimes low-tech. and more human-centered. And I want to ask you, Claire, Debra, because you've actually been to the Netherlands recently, and it was one of the things that struck you as an outsider, so to speak, that a lot of the solutions there, from your perspective, seem to be low-tech. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So AARP just did a study tour in the Netherlands. A year ago, we were in Japan and Taiwan looking at those countries and innovations they had there. Netherlands really blew me away. We did 12 different visits in 1 week. One of the things that stood out was a apartment where they were actually testing different kinds of technology. And local older adults could spend the night there and try everything out. And then they would give information back to the designers of the technology about what was working and what wasn't. And what surprised me was some of the very low-tech things in the apartment were the most successful. There was a sensor that anytime the smoke alarm went off, it shut the gas off on the stove. Was something that everybody who went in wanted, and they'd sold out of them very, very quickly, because once you burn your kitchen down, you're not going to be able to stay at home. And so this was a low-tech solution that created safety in the home, safety for anyone in the area, whether it was a mom who went to go take care of a young child and forgot the food on the stove, to an older adult. They also found things like watches that were designed for older adults sometimes didn't work as well when the buttons were small. And so they could give that feedback back to the tech designers and show ways to use it. We also went to a rehab hospital where they had tried 3 different levels of sensors that kept track of people's movements. Sensors are very popular technology in the design phase, but they were on their 3rd round of companies because the first 2 rounds gave so much information about every time they opened their fridge or walked down the hall that the family members or the medical professionals that were looking at it were overwhelmed. So they had a simple system with a red, orange, and green light, orange for the Netherlands, that alerted to changes in patterns or things to be aware of. And so how do we take technology, which can be helpful in so many situations? One, make sure that older people know how to use it, make sure that it is designed for their needs, not for the designer's needs, and then really solves real life problems. I think this is a massive, again, 1/4 of the world's population. This is a massive business opportunity, and something that AARP works directly with businesses to think about. We have an innovation lab in our office in DC, and we work with tech companies on all kinds of new ideas and giving them insights into our population's needs, wants, likes, dislikes. All of that is something that the design process needs to have in mind.
Yeah, and so you learned a lot of things in the Netherlands and in Japan that you could then later apply in the US. And so I think that must be one of the things that comes forward from your study, is sort of the solutions that are found in one country perhaps can also be applied elsewhere. I want to get back to that in just a second, but before I do, I want to make sure I give the opportunity, at least, should there be any question in the room, if you want to ask any question, if you want to do that now. So just have a quick look if there's any questions. Okay, so I want to get back to this point of, to what extent can we actually apply, for example, what works in the Netherlands to whether it will work in the US, but perhaps in other countries that you've looked at. Is that really possible? Because, of course, one of the things when we were doing the preparation of this discussion is, well, Regine was talking about the fact that we've got a very specific society. You talked about the polder model, which basically is very, very specific to the geography of the country, of the Netherlands. And you said, well, you can apply that in New York, perhaps because it was once New Amsterdam. But that joke aside, or I don't know, maybe it's not a joke. But that anecdote aside, to what extent can we really apply these best practices from other countries to our country?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things when you look at these 10 small countries and why these small economies are doing so well is because they tend to be very open to what other people are doing around the world. So they're leapfrogging on a lot of these issues. So there are programs in Taiwan that are based on programs they saw in Japan, which aged before they did. And we are seeing it's too small a scale, and that's part of why we're doing this work, is so that we can bubble up these great ideas and get the attention so they can be applied elsewhere. But you really are seeing the potential for programs to be replicated. A program that started and this is from last year, but a program that started in Denver, I think in the 1970s, putting nursing homes and daycares together, is all over Germany. So it didn't grow in the United States hugely, but someone from Germany saw it decades ago, and it's been replicated there all over the place. So we are seeing that potential. There are great ideas, and they are replicable. Some of them are very specific to a cultural context, but a lot of them aren't. We do face so many of the same challenges. And I think that one of the reasons that you see 4 of our countries have aging technology as part of their national competitiveness strategy, because they see that these are common challenges. They want to be the exporter of this tech that is needed all around the world.
Yeah.
I think we have more in common than we have than difference.
So and of course you've looked at the course of the last 2 years to 22 countries, and so surely any country in the world can find a best practice that they believe they can apply to their own society. One point I did want to talk about, because I didn't quite know what it meant, is with these 10 small countries in particular. One of the points I saw in your executive summary is, on the one hand, you said what they shared is that they had an outward orientation, so that they were essentially open to trade, for example, but also had diaspora communities. But on the other hand, what they also shared was that they were quite cohesive societies, constrained by certain natural resources, scarcity, or geographic positions, but with a tradition of shared collective responses to challenges. Now, when I read that, I get a little bit concerned for countries that are typically very open, not just to trade, but then particularly to people, to immigration. Is it possible to have a cohesive society that has sort of a joint response, a strong response, while at the same time being an open society? Is there anyone who could comment on that?
Well, we've been an open society, and we've had influx from the 1400s in the Netherlands. Now, it is very true, and I find it very important that you make this remark, because we have a migrant population which is increasing, from the southern part of Europe coming in, from Middle East is coming in. And of course, we have this traditional, on the one hand, cohesive society in different groupings, and on the other hand, being very innovative, very trade-oriented. So in absorbing new communities, that takes time. And it's a great, great challenge at present to absorb the migrant groups from so many different countries into the present context, which then will elaborate in a new kind of cohesiveness. That's a challenge. We cannot take that for granted, especially also now with second generation migrant elderly people. We might have thought they would go back to their home country. They will not, because their children and grandchildren are in the Netherlands. So we have to come up with new things for them as well. That's one of the things you see in the dementia homes, where we have dementia villages, where people from different groups have their own home because they like their own food, their own tablecloth, their own way of living. So you have these living labs together in a kind of surrounded nursing home, protective and safe environment. But also throughout our aging in place at home, we will have to find new adjustments for these cultures. So that's a really a big challenge for our communities.
Let me add one thing, and
Sure.
I think this is true across the reports. We take a very strengths-based approach. So you may see somebody who is physically incapacitated, but they have a strong mind and can help teach a child. Right? I saw in Japan We went to a dementia ward, and they said their best caregivers often didn't speak Japanese, but they were very huggy and very emotional in a way that would connect with the individual. And so I think, you know, in whatever capacity we look at across the life course, children have strengths and weaknesses. As we work and live and raise our families, we all have strengths and weaknesses and limitation. Mine is time. As we age, we're going to have strengths and weaknesses. And if we don't look and use those strengths across the population, one of the nursing homes I visited in the Netherlands had extra rooms. And so they allowed students to live there for free because they brought the world inside. And the students were grateful to have a free place to live so that they could afford to go to school. They also had a dormitory for young adults with mental disabilities. And they interacted with the older people who had physically disabilities. So again, these are the types of programs that Claire highlighted in our reports that are going across the globe, where if you have these pieces of innovation and try and look for success stories, we can really change the world. And that's why we did this report.
Yeah.
Again, not everything is going to apply to every place, but there are good ideas that we need to multiply by 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 100 million. And if we do that, and the countries that do that, and the communities that do that, are going to be not just more competitive, they're going to be a better place to live.
Yeah, and I think that there's no better way to end our press conference than with that very positive and forward-looking note. I want to thank all the panelists again for being here to present the report. You can also download it at home, again, at arc2018.aarpinternational.org. You can find both the executive summary and also the full report there. Thank you again to the panelists, and thank you for joining us.